Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. Through the Smoke of Serendipity. The café on Rue de Lumière had always been a sanctuary for the eccentric and the curious. Its walls, papered with pages torn from forgotten novels, whispered stories to anyone willing to listen. On a Tuesday morning, as the first light of winter filtered through frost-kissed windows, Evelyn Moreau walked in, a storm of disheveled auburn curls and half-buttoned overcoats. Evelyn wasn't looking for love. She wasn't even looking for coffee. She needed an escape. The kind of escape that involved silence, solitude, and perhaps a notebook where she could sketch out the ruins of her last 3 months. She didn't expect the man seated at the corner table, sketching with the precision of an architect but the soul of an artist. Kieran Winters wasn't the type to visit cafes, but today was an exception. His usual haunts, a cluttered loft and the sprawling city park, had grown stale. Something about the cafe's odd charm had drawn him in. As he worked on the intricate details of a design, the pencil between his fingers snapped. Muttering under his breath, he scanned the room for a spare. It was Evelyn's notebook he spotted first. Her fingers paused mid-scribble as she caught his glance. Before she could second-guess herself, she slid the pencil across the table toward him, their hands brushing in the briefest of exchanges. "Mercy," Kieran murmured, his accent more Irish than French. She smiled faintly, more intrigued than amused. "De rien, but it comes with a price." Kieran arched a brow. "And what might that be? A peek at whatever masterpiece you're working on." He hesitated. The design was a personal project, a reimagining of a city skyline, laced with impossibilities like staircases leading to nowhere and bridges vanishing into clouds. But something about Evelyn's curiosity felt genuine, unprying. Wordlessly, he turned the sketchpad toward her. Her laughter was unexpected, light, musical, and wholly unguarded. "It's enchanting," she said, eyes tracing the surreal details. "Like Escher, but with hope." Kieran chuckled. "That's a first." From there, their conversation spilled like wine from an overfilled glass, staining the air between them with vibrant colors. Evelyn's world of chaotic freelance photography collided with Kieran's methodical architectural vision. Hours passed unnoticed, their coffee cups empty and forgotten. As they parted ways, Evelyn scribbled her number in the corner of Kieran's sketchpad. She lingered for a moment before leaning in and whispering, "Call me when you finish the stairs to nowhere." Kieran watched her leave, the cafe door jingling softly in her wake. He turned back to his sketchpad, only to find her number smeared into the ink of his drawing. It blurred, almost unreadable, except for the last digits. Fate, it seemed, wanted to leave the ending unfinished. Chapter 2. Stairs to Nowhere. Kieran spent the next week chasing ghosts. Evelyn had left him with a puzzle, a fragmented phone number, and a fleeting impression. He didn't realize how deeply their brief encounter had imprinted on him until he found himself revisiting the cafe every day, sketchpad in hand. It wasn't the same, though. Without her, the place felt quieter, its charm muted. The incomplete number sat at the edge of his work table in his loft, mocking him. He tried combinations late into the night, dialing random digits in desperation. Each failed attempt echoed in the silence, but something stubborn in him refused to give up. Meanwhile, Evelyn had her own distractions. The city became her canvas. She spent hours chasing moments through her lens, shadows cast by ancient buildings, the kaleidoscope of winter markets, and once, the silhouette of a man who reminded her of Kieran. She dismissed the thought, but her heart raced for reasons she couldn't explain. One evening, while developing her photos in her makeshift darkroom, she found it. A candid shot she hadn't realized she'd taken. Kieran, pencil in hand, head bent over his sketchpad, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It was the day they met, frozen in time. Her fingers hovered over the print. She wanted to frame it, yet she hesitated. A part of her didn't want to hold on to something she might never find again. Kieran finally abandoned the phone number and returned to what he knew best, his sketches. The staircase to nowhere took on new life. He added new twists, railings that spiraled like vines, steps that turned into clouds. But no matter how elaborate it became, the design felt empty. It was late one night when he decided to walk the city, his thoughts too restless for sleep. The cold bit at his skin, but the fresh air helped. His feet carried him without direction until he found himself at the edge of the Seine. The river glimmered under the city lights, and for a moment he felt at peace. Until he saw her. Evelyn was standing on the opposite bank, her camera poised as she captured the reflections on the water. He froze, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Was it really her, or was his mind playing tricks? "Evelyn," he called, his voice breaking the stillness of the night. She turned, startled, and then her face lit up with recognition. "Kieran," she called back, her voice carrying across the river. They stared at each other for a moment, the distance between them feeling both vast and insignificant. Then, without thinking, Kieran sprinted to the nearest bridge, his heart pounding as he crossed to her side. When they met again, it was like the week apart had never happened. Words spilled out in a chaotic tumble, filling in the gaps their absence had left. She showed him the photo she'd taken, and he marveled at how she'd managed to capture him so vividly. But just as the moment seemed perfect, the unusual twist arrived. Evelyn glanced at her watch and frowned. "I have to go," she said abruptly. Kieran blinked, caught off guard. "Go? Where?" She hesitated, her expression unreadable. "It's complicated, but I'll explain, soon." She stepped back, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Find me again, Kieran. I'll be waiting." And just like that, she disappeared into the night, leaving him standing by the Seine, his heart heavier than before. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Act. The air felt colder after Evelyn left, the empty space beside Kieran sharp and unsettling. He watched her silhouette melt into the Parisian night, his mind racing with questions. Why had she left so suddenly? Why hadn't she told him where she was going? For days, Kieran couldn't shake the memory of her fleeting goodbye. He tried sketching, but every line curved back to her. He roamed the city, retracing their steps, hoping to stumble upon her. Nothing. She had vanished as though the city itself had swallowed her whole. One night, as he sifted through his old sketches, he noticed something he'd overlooked. Evelyn's handwriting. At the bottom of the page where she'd scribbled her half-faded number, there was a faint imprint, almost invisible but unmistakable under the right light. The words, "La Tour Céleste," emerged, written in the delicate strokes of her pen. La Tour Céleste? Kieran muttered, puzzled. The name didn't ring any bells. Fueled by curiosity, he turned to the internet. It took some digging, but he found it. A forgotten art studio in Montmartre, rumored to host underground exhibitions. The next evening, Kieran arrived at the address, a weathered building tucked between two modern apartments. The sign was barely legible, the paint peeling away, but the words La Tour Céleste still lingered like a whisper of the past. Inside, the studio was alive with chaos. Paintings lined the walls, sculptures filled the corners, and people milled about, their voices mingling like an improvised symphony. Kieran scanned the room, his heart pounding. Was she here? At first, he didn't see her. Then, in the far corner, surrounded by a cluster of people, was Evelyn. But something was different. She wasn't just observing, she was the center of attention. A large canvas stood behind her, a surreal landscape of twisting staircases and fragmented cities, eerily similar to the sketches Kieran had shared with her. His heart sank and soared at once. Had she taken his work, or had it inspired her? Evelyn spotted him before he could decide. Her face lit up, but the flash of joy was fleeting. She excused herself from the group and hurried toward him. "Kieran," she said, her voice breathless. "You found me." "You didn't make it easy," he replied, trying to mask the swirl of emotions in his chest. "What is this?" He gestured to the painting behind her. She hesitated, her gaze darting to the canvas. "It's complicated, but I owe you an explanation." Before she could say more, a tall man approached, his presence commanding. "Evelyn," he said, his tone sharp, "it's time." She flinched, her fingers curling into fists. "Just a moment, Victor." Victor's eyes shifted to Kieran, studying him with a cold detachment. "Don't take too long." As Victor walked away, Evelyn turned back to Kieran, her expression torn. "I'm sorry. I didn't want you to find out like this." "Find out what?" Kieran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't steal your work, I swear," she said quickly. "But I used it. I had to. Victor, he's not just my mentor. He's—" She stopped, biting her lip as though afraid to speak. "Let's just say he controls more than he should." Kieran frowned, the puzzle only deepening. "Evelyn, what's going on? Why are you working with him?" I don't have a choice, she said, her voice cracking. But I promise I'll make this right. Before Kieran could reply, Victor called her again, his voice laced with impatience. Evelyn cast Kieran a desperate look. Please, trust me, and don't stop looking for me. She turned and walked away, leaving Kieran with more questions than answers. That night, he couldn't sleep. The surreal painting haunted him, its imagery too personal to ignore. Something about Victor's presence felt off, as though he were more than just a mentor. Evelyn was caught in something far bigger than she'd let on, and Kieran knew one thing for certain. He wasn't about to let her face it alone. Chapter 4. Beneath the Mask. Kieran couldn't shake the weight of Evelyn's plea. Her words replayed in his mind, pulling him deeper into a mystery he hadn't asked to be part of. But it wasn't just Evelyn's desperation that haunted him. It was Victor's gaze. Cold, calculating, and predatory. The next day, Kieran returned to La Tour Celeste, but the studio was locked, its windows shrouded by heavy curtains. The air around the place felt different, as though it were holding its breath. He tried asking a shopkeeper nearby, but the old man shook his head. "It's a private circle," he muttered. "They don't take kindly to strangers." Frustrated but undeterred, Kieran decided to follow a different lead, the painting. He couldn't stop thinking about its uncanny resemblance to his sketches. How had Evelyn recreated his vision so vividly? Back at his loft, he studied his own work alongside photos he'd taken of Evelyn's painting. A strange detail jumped out at him. Hidden in the corners of both pieces were tiny symbols, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. They resembled runes or archaic writing, spiraling into the edges of the designs. Determined to decipher their meaning, Kieran turned to research. Hours passed as he combed through forums and archives, eventually stumbling upon an obscure reference to a secret society of artists known as Les Enigmes. They were said to blend art with alchemy, embedding hidden truths and forbidden knowledge into their works. The symbol in Evelyn's painting matched one associated with the group. Suddenly, Victor's controlling demeanor made sense. If he was tied to Les Enigmes, Evelyn might be trapped in something far darker than artistic mentorship. The next evening, Kieran decided to confront her. He waited near the studio, shrouded in the shadows of a narrow alley. Hours passed before Evelyn emerged, her steps hurried and her expression tense. "Evelyn," he called softly, stepping into her path. She froze, her eyes widening in shock. "Kieran, you shouldn't be here. And you shouldn't be running," he countered. "I know about Les Enigmes. I know Victor's controlling you. Talk to me." Her shoulders slumped, and she glanced around as if afraid of being overheard. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Victor isn't just controlling me. He owns me." "What does that even mean?" Kieran asked, his voice rising. She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. "Here," she said, thrusting it into his hands. "This will explain everything. But you have to leave now. If Victor sees you—" A shadow fell over them. "He already has." Victor's voice cut through the night like a blade. Kieran turned to find Victor standing a few feet away, his face calm but his eyes burning with menace. "Evelyn, I told you not to stray," he said coldly. "She's not your property," Kieran snapped, stepping between them. Victor smirked. "Brave words, but you don't understand the game you're playing." Before Kieran could respond, Victor raised a hand, and suddenly the air around them shifted. A strange hum filled the alley, and Kieran's vision blurred. The ground seemed to ripple beneath him, and for a terrifying moment it felt as though reality itself was unraveling. "Enough," Evelyn shouted, stepping forward. "Victor, leave him out of this." Victor's smirk deepened. "Very well, but remember, Evelyn, you owe me." With a flick of his wrist, the distortion stopped. The alley fell silent again, but Kieran's legs gave out, and he sank to the ground. Evelyn knelt beside him, her eyes filled with guilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "What was that?" Kieran managed, his voice shaking. "It's Victor's power," she said softly. "He's not just an artist. He's something else, something I can't explain." She stood abruptly, her expression hardening. "You need to leave, Kieran. Forget you ever met me." "Not a chance," he said, grabbing her hand. "I'm not leaving you with him." Evelyn shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "You don't understand. He'll destroy you." "Then let him try," Kieran said, his voice steady. "But I'm not giving up on you." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, her resolve wavering. Then, without another word, she turned and ran, leaving Kieran alone in the alley, clutching the notebook that held the answers he desperately needed. Chapter 5. The Notebook's Curse. Kieran returned to his loft with Evelyn's notebook clutched tightly in his hands. His mind reeled from what he had witnessed, Victor's power, the way reality seemed to bend at his will. This wasn't just an art rivalry or a toxic mentorship, it was something far more dangerous. The notebook was old, its leather cover worn and frayed at the edges. As he flipped it open, he noticed the pages were filled with sketches, notes, and symbols. Some were Evelyn's, recognizable by her fluid handwriting. Others, however, seemed older, the ink faded as if from another time entirely. In the center of the notebook was a diagram, a staircase spiraling endlessly upward, surrounded by cryptic annotations. One phrase repeated over and over, written in Evelyn's hand: "The Ascension demands a sacrifice." Kieran's chest tightened as he studied the drawing. The staircase was eerily similar to the one he had sketched and the one Evelyn had painted. But now it felt less like art and more like a blueprint for something sinister. The next few pages revealed more about Les Enigmes. They weren't just artists. They were seekers of power, using their creations as conduits to manipulate the world around them. Victor, it seemed, was their leader, and Evelyn had somehow become ensnared in their web. One page was different from the others, marked with a blood-red symbol that seemed to pulsate faintly under the light. Beneath it was a single sentence: "To ascend, one must fall." Kieran's focus was interrupted by a knock at his door. He froze, his heart racing. Was it Evelyn? Or worse, Victor? He crept toward the door, peering through the peephole. A figure stood in the hallway, cloaked in shadow. "Kieran Winters," the voice called, calm but commanding. "We need to talk." Reluctantly, Kieran opened the door. The man standing there was older, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through him. "Who are you?" Kieran demanded. "My name is Alaric," the man said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I'm a defector from Les Enigmes, and if you want to save Evelyn, you'll listen carefully." Kieran's hands clenched into fists. "How do you know about Evelyn?" Alaric sighed. "Because I was the one who brought her to Victor. I didn't know what he had planned for her, but by the time I realized, it was too late." Kieran glared at him. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," Alaric said bluntly. "But if you care about Evelyn, you don't have a choice. She's the key to Victor's ascension, and he'll do whatever it takes to complete it." "Ascension?" Kieran asked, his voice edged with skepticism. Alaric gestured to the notebook in Kieran's hand. "It's all there. Victor believes that by channeling enough creative energy, he can transcend humanity and become something more. But to do that, he needs a vessel, someone who embodies the purest form of artistic expression. That's why he chose Evelyn." Kieran's blood ran cold. "He's going to sacrifice her?" "Yes," Alaric said grimly, "unless we stop him." Alaric laid out a plan, one that hinged on disrupting the ritual Victor was preparing. The ritual would culminate at midnight during the winter solstice, less than 2 days away. "Victor will be at the Grand Atelier," Alaric explained. "It's where Les Enigmes gather for their most sacred ceremonies. If we can get there and destroy the centerpiece of his ritual, the Ascension staircase, we can break his hold on Evelyn." Kieran nodded, determination hardening in his chest. "Then we'll do it." But Alaric's expression darkened. "It won't be that simple. The atelier is heavily guarded, and Victor's influence runs deep. He'll sense us coming, and if we fail, you'll lose her forever." Kieran met Alaric's gaze, his jaw set. "Then we won't fail." That night, as Kieran prepared for the confrontation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a world far beyond his understanding. But one thing was clear. He would face any danger, defy any odds, to save Evelyn. As midnight approached, Kieran and Alaric made their way through the city, the streets eerily silent. The Grand Atelier loomed ahead, its towering facade illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Inside, the air was thick with power. The Ascension staircase stood at the center of the room, a towering structure of marble and light, pulsing with an unnatural energy. And at its base stood Victor, his eyes gleaming with triumph, Evelyn at his side. Chapter 6. The Fall and the Rise. The grand atelier was alive with an unnatural energy. Shadows stretched and twisted under the pulsating light of the Ascension staircase, a structure too perfect, too alien to be of human design. It spiraled impossibly high, its steps seeming to dissolve into nothingness. Kieran's breath hitched as he saw Evelyn standing at the base of the staircase. Her face was pale, her expression vacant, as though she were caught in a trance. Victor stood beside her, his hands raised as he chanted in a language that made Kieran's ears ring. "She's already tethered to the ritual," Alaric whispered. "We have to move fast." Kieran clenched his fists, his gaze locked on Evelyn. "What happens if she climbs those stairs?" "She won't climb them willingly," Alaric said grimly. "Victor will force her. And when she reaches the top, her essence, her soul, will merge with the power of the staircase. Victor will take everything from her." "And what happens to Evelyn?" Alaric hesitated. "She'll cease to exist." The words hit Kieran like a punch to the gut. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not letting that happen." The two men slipped into the room, staying in the shadows. Kieran's heart pounded as he inched closer to Evelyn. She was so close, yet impossibly far away. Victor's chanting grew louder, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. The staircase began to glow brighter, the runes along its surface pulsating like a heartbeat. Kieran could see the moment Victor noticed them. His chanting stopped abruptly, and his eyes snapped to theirs, filled with cold fury. "So, the stray dog returns," Victor sneered. "And you brought a traitor with you." "Let her go, Victor," Kieran said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. Victor chuckled darkly. "You don't understand, do you? Evelyn isn't a prisoner. She's the key. Without her, the Ascension cannot be completed, and I won't let you take that from me." He raised a hand, and the air around them shimmered. Suddenly, Kieran felt an invisible force slam into him, throwing him across the room. "Kieran!" Evelyn's voice broke through the haze. Her trance shattered. She took a step toward him, but Victor grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "You belong to me," Victor hissed. "No, she doesn't," Kieran shouted, forcing himself to his feet. His body ached, but he pushed the pain aside. He glanced at Alaric, who had moved toward the base of the staircase, a small vial of liquid in his hand. "What are you doing?" Kieran demanded. "Destroying the staircase," Alaric replied. "It's the only way to stop the ritual." But Victor saw him too. With a flick of his wrist, Alaric was hurled backward, the vial shattering against the floor. "No!" Kieran shouted, lunging toward the staircase. He grabbed one of the glowing runes and pain shot through his arm, but he didn't let go. The structure trembled under his touch, cracks forming along its surface. Victor's expression twisted with rage. "Fool, you'll destroy us all." "Better that than let you win," Kieran spat. Evelyn broke free from Victor's grip, her eyes blazing with determination. "Kieran, stop!" she cried. "If the staircase falls, so will you." "I don't care," Kieran said, his voice steady. "As long as you're safe." Evelyn's face crumpled and she rushed to his side. Together they pressed their hands against the staircase, the cracks spreading like spider webs. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, and the room shook violently. Victor screamed, his voice distorted and inhuman. "You don't understand what you're destroying. This power was meant to be mine." "Not anymore," Evelyn said fiercely. With one final push, the staircase shattered, the light exploding outward in a brilliant flash. When the light faded, the room was silent. The staircase was gone, reduced to dust. Victor lay crumpled on the ground, his body motionless, his power stripped away. Kieran opened his eyes slowly, pain coursing through his body. Evelyn was beside him, her face streaked with tears. "You're alive," she whispered, relief flooding her voice. "Barely," Kieran said with a weak smile. Alaric approached them, his expression somber. "You did it," he said. "You stopped him." "But at what cost?" Kieran asked, his voice heavy. Evelyn reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. "We're alive. That's all that matters." In the weeks that followed, Evelyn and Kieran tried to return to normalcy. The shadows of Les Enigmes faded, and the Grand Atelier was abandoned, its secrets buried. Evelyn's art changed. Her pieces were no longer haunted by the darkness of Victor's influence. Instead, they were filled with light and hope. And Kieran? He sketched staircases again, but this time they always had an end.